freedoms painted by Norman Rockwell. Now, these four freedoms paintings were done 75 years ago. So this is the 75th anniversary of the four freedoms. And of course, I'll have better images of those in a minute. But of course, it's the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. Now, we've heard about these freedoms before, haven't we? They're ingrained in our culture, and they're ingrained in our freedoms. So it wasn't just discovered 75 years ago. These freedoms have been around a long, long time, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what about the paintings themselves? And I believe that these paintings, strangely enough, were born out of three tragedies. What were the driving forces behind painting these four freedoms, and what was the little history behind it? The three factors I feel that were most influential was the major war that was fought during the same period of time, 1939 to 1945. A school burns down, and a farmer loses his herd of cows. If 200 years from now, someone looked back, a historian, what were the factors that created this? I think these three factors were certainly aspects of making these paintings come to life. By 1929, the combination of the Ladies' Home Journal and the Saturday Evening Post captured over 3 million subscribers, and together those two magazines retained 40% of the advertising of all journals in America. 40%. It's incredible. Of course, he was helped out by George Horace Lorimer. George Horace Lorimer joined Cyrus Curtis in 1899, and he ran the Saturday Evening Post with an iron fist. He ran every detail from the cover, the cartoons, the articles, everything. But he demanded success, and he got it. So he was the editor-in-chief. He later became actually the president and then the CEO of the Curtis Publishing Company. Now, interesting, this post cover was done by an Arlington artist named John Atherton, and also known as Jack Atherton. And Jack, you see, retained this Benjamin Franklin theme. And of course, what happened was he continued to paint these every New Year's. And so every New Year's would be a Benjamin Franklin photo or picture like this. Now, the Saturday Evening Post, as I said, became one of the most widely circulated, influential magazines in America during this period of the 1920s and 30s. And along the way, they captured Norman Rockwell. Well, they didn't really capture him. What happened was Norman had a roommate, if you will, in his studio named Clyde Forsyth, and Clyde was a cartoonist. Now, Clyde just had a great relationship with Norman. Clyde was doing cartoons, and here's Norman doing more serious, semi-serious paintings. And it was Clyde who convinced Norman to submit some works for the Saturday Evening Post. And one interesting line was, Norman didn't know what to do. He's only 22 years old, so he started copying what we call the Gibson Girls. And it was kind of a romantic man dressed in a suit and a woman all glorious. And of course, when Clyde Forsyth saw that, he said to Norman, "It's crud. This is crud. This is terrible. It's horrible." And of course, imagine the forcefulness of his critique of Norman, but it was good. He said, "Do Norman Rockwell. You're good at that." And Norman did. He went down and submitted his first Saturday Evening Post cover, and this is it done in 1916. Now, at the same period that we're talking about now, we're talking about this period of 1936. Unfortunately, George Horace Lorimer resigned, or he retired. He died a year later, so we knew he was sick. And so the Saturday Evening Post had some real challenges. Photojournalism and radio were getting heavy in the 1930s. And of course, it was capturing a great deal of the customer base from the Saturday Evening Post. A new editor, Wesley Stout, took over. And Wesley Stout was the opposite of George Horace Lorimer, and he was a pain in the neck to Norman Rockwell. What happened was Wesley Stout would critique Norman's paintings, and he'd say, "Don't you think we ought to change the shoes from black to brown?" and stuff like that. And it just drove Norman crazy. He couldn't get his wheels under him. And so Norman was challenged by Wesley Stout. Also out on the street in New York, he was hearing rumors that maybe the Saturday Evening Post is going to go under. So all of this turmoil was taking place, and it was a very difficult time for Norman. So we're back up to 1936 here, 1936 and 37. It was a tremendously transformative period for Norman Rockwell. And I don't even think he knew what was happening to himself at this time. One thing that happened was the camera. As the camera became more and more a part of the artist toolkit, it was rejected by the purist, and it was rejected by Norman Rockwell himself. And I have a cute thing. I just think I'll read it. I hate to read to the audience, but I think you'll get a kick out of it. He says, Norman says here, "First, I used photographs only occasionally, trying to hang on to at least the shreds of my self-respect. But it was like taking a touch of morphine, and now and then, pretty soon, before I knew it, I was addicted. A guilty, shamefaced addict, but an addict nevertheless, because photographs cleared up all my difficulties immediately. I could get the new weird angles. I no longer had to depend on the professional models. Now anybody could pose for me." See how it set the stage for where Norman was at this time. And I think what I wanted to demonstrate here, now this is the first Saturday Evening Post cover. You see it's quite flat. It's almost like the models are sitting right in front of you, 10 feet in front of you. Look how complex his post cover became back in the 1940s. He used the full bleed of the cover itself. Here it's just purely white background, and that format was used for years under George Horace Lorimer. But by the time they got to this period of time, this was done in East Arlington. It's called Shuffleton's Barbershop. It's a fabulous painting. And the canvases became large and more complex. You see what he could do with the lighting, you see. He had that ability to change his art. And as I just read to you, I no longer needed professional models. Imagine the professional models had to sit there for hours and hours and hours. Well, you can't pay someone at that point for hours and hours. And pretty soon, he found himself able to use photographs, and then he could go back and do his work. I demonstrate this. This was an inside edition, not a cover. And only for the reason that we all talk around, we have models reunions of Arlington models, and we get together. And I say, this is the most unidentified model in Arlington history. His name is Don Crofit. He still comes to the models reunion, and it's kind of fun. But you can even see in this case, you couldn't have these models sitting there posing for hours and days. So it just gave them that freedom. Well, by 1938, we're getting back up to 1938, he'd been painting covers now for 22 years. He was at the top of his game. He was worshipped by the editorial staff at the Saturday Evening Post. But it brought about this sense of insecurity. And as I said, it goes back to Stout, the editor who took over, and Norman felt this sort of self-reflection. He felt here that if a cover was unpopular, his work was sagging. He had a fear of being dropped from the post. All these insecurities, and you think, gee, he is probably one of the most fabulous illustrators in American history, and he felt this way. But this was the period of 1938. He said in his book, I felt like part of my life had ended. Pretty dramatic. Well, what happened? In 1938, off to Europe. He decided, let's take a trip. Maybe I can shake myself up and get my feet on the ground again. So he takes his family off to Europe, and he had 3 boys at this point. He had been married once before. His new wife, Mary, and the 3 boys went to England. There he met with several English illustrators, and these illustrators do everything from periodicals and books and children's books and so forth. But he wasn't satisfied. And he'd find himself in the afternoons and evenings riding his bike. He always loved to ride a bike. I don't know why. I guess, well, it's a good mode of transportation in 1938. And his kids sometimes would sit on the handlebars as he's pedaling through the countryside. And he realized he just loved the farms over there, the beautiful rolling hills and farms. And the thought went through his brain, maybe a farm. Why not a farm? Well, he and Mary when they arrived back in New York, they decided, let's go up to Vermont. Let's just check it out. There was a artist, a model in New York that he used in New Rochelle, New York, named Hildebrand. And Hildebrand had been up here, and he was a fisherman, and he kind of encouraged all the artist friends to come on up to Vermont. There's great fishing. Well, his first episode was Mary, they left the boys behind. Mary and Norman went to Bennington. It was in the fall, just about this same time, and there was cider. And evidently the realtors were drinking a little too much cider. And they had this joyride through the country, and it was getting a little wild for Norman and Mary, so they decided, well, let's go up to Manchester. But when they got to Manchester, they were shown houses, and then the realtor said, you know, there's a cocktail party every afternoon. Well, that wasn't really what Norman was looking for. Well, they went back to Arlington to the Colonial Inn, and the proprietor's name was Happy Bottom. Don't ask me his first real name, but Happy Bottom. I remember this character much later in the years, and walking up and down Route 7. But it was Happy Bottom who introduced Norman to Bert Inman. Now, Bert Inman became the premier realtor of Arlington, and he's the one who basically sold everybody every house in Arlington. Well, they started a search for a farmhouse right there in Arlington, and just to give you a quick glance, what was Arlington like in 1938, 1939? Well, there were some thriving businesses, the Hawley Furniture Company, the Arlington Refrigerator Company. And there were some inventive people from New Jersey named Kendall, and they moved and started a company called Mack Molding. And Mack Molding, as you know, thrives to this day, and it's one of the largest employers in the state of Vermont. Now, Arlington had kind of 3 groups of population in those days. In East Arlington, what we call East Arlington, very quiet community, beautiful old dirt roads, just an excellent place to live. The main street of Arlington looked like this. There was this beautiful inn. Next door was the town hall. And then Martha Camfield Fisher lived in this home, and her niece was Dorothy Camfield Fisher, the writer and author. And then, of course, the Colonial Inn would be further down. But Main Street was a beautiful area. Across the street from the Colonial Inn is the Episcopal Church, St. James Church, and it's still there today, and it looks just like it did 100 years ago. And then you have West Arlington. So you have these 3 pockets. West Arlington, mostly made up of farming communities, at least 14 or 15 farms in that area. Again, looking down into the West Arlington Valley. The covered bridge for West Arlington, and which later became Norman Rockwell's home, is probably about in there. So it's just, but it gives you that flavor for what it looked like in 1938, 1939. Well, the next day, Norman and Bert Inman and Mary went looking for a house. They found this on what we call River Road, and it's going down toward West Arlington. It's on the dirt road side of 313. And it's called the Parsons House, a family named Parsons that owned this for years, this farming community. Here are a couple of barns right here, and here's the Battenkill River. And obviously in this picture, it must have been after they purchased it. There's a great deal of cutting here that I'm sure Norman said, let's get it prepared. This is 1938, and of course, the next year, the following year, they're moving up for the summer. That was the plan, that the Rockwells would move here for the summer. Well, he loved it. He came up to Vermont. The house was not winterized. They were living with wood stoves, trying to maintain, and the winters were brutal in that time. There was many nights of 30 below. But Norman loved it. He fell in love with Arlington. He fell in love with everything. And again, I love the quotes out of this book. It's called Norman Rockwell, My Adventures as an Illustrator, 1960, and it was done with his son, Tom. And it's just a beautiful book. So it says, he said, it's like living in another world, more honest one somehow. And I think there was a driving force out of New York in 1939. I think that a lot of things were happening and brewing, perhaps because of the war effort that was getting kindled up. But I think for an artist like Norman, he just loved this. He fell in love with it. And he had another fellow artist named Mead Schaefer, and they kind of moved together, and they both bought places intending only as summer homes. What Norman liked, he said, if Harvey McKee, now Harvey McKee was one of his favorite models, became one of his favorite models. He said if Harvey was taken sick, Jim Edgerton would do his milking. And that's the kind of community that they were living in the times. Now look at, I met 100 or 200 people I wanted to paint. He couldn't find anything down in New Rochelle. Remember, in 1936, he was lost. He thought he was going to be out of business. Now he has, and I think, again, back to the photographic technology. It allowed him now. It just opened up his eyes. He said, ideas were jumping in my brain like trout on the Battenkill at sunset. It's a fabulous time for Norman. And guess what? They got to the fall, and his friend Mead Schaefer said, I'm not moving back. I'm not going back to New Rochelle. And Mead says, I'm not going either. And so they stayed. They just never went back to New Rochelle. By the fall of September 1939, this was Norman's very first Saturday Evening Post cover that he did in Arlington. And the characters here, Ruth McLenith and Skelly, Jarvis Rockwell, his son, and Winston Salter. Now, I'm sad to say, Ruth just died last week. I'm sorry about that. It's emotional because she's become part of our family. You know, I mean, she's been the star. She's 90 years old and just vibrant and healthy, but her service was just the other day. Arlington also became vibrant because it gathered, it started to attract a number of artists. And so the flavor here is that we had a gathering of authors, illustrators, cartoonists, composers, and so forth. And here's Mead Schaefer, perhaps Norman's very best friend and the man that he trusted and was in confidence with as a critic of his work. Gene Pelham became Norman's photographer while he was in Arlington. Now, this period that Norman was in Arlington, 1939, and he left in 53, to give you a rough idea there. John Atherton, this is the man who did the Benjamin Franklin. So John Atherton did 42 Saturday Evening Post covers himself. He died at 52 years old, and it's sad to say, but you know, he died fishing. He was up in Nova Scotia, 52 years old. He dropped dead of a heart attack in the river, and in some ways, the saddest part is that he's only 52. He could have done enormous amounts of beautiful work. George Hughes, these were all Saturday Evening Post cover illustrators along with Norman Rockwell. And then, of course, Dorothy Canfield Fisher, the author. Rockwell Kent was another artist, but he lived in Arlington just prior to this period, so more like the 20s and early 30s. But Rockwell Kent, remember that name. And then Carl Ruggles, another artist, and he was another artist and composer. And then it just shows this vibrancy of this community. And here you can see, here's Norman here, Vic Donahue, here's George Hughes, here's my father, and here's Gene Pelham and Vic Donahue, and just shows this closeness of this community. Well, Jim had this farm. Electricity didn't come to West Arlington until 1937. This is 2 years later. Imagine this. Now, Jim lost all but one heifer to a disease called brucellosis. It's a contagious disease. The farming industry of Vermont were scared to death of it because if it got into the milk, it could get transferred, and it was a terrible disease. And if your herd got caught with this, they tested every cow. Jim lost all but one heifer. His whole livelihood was gone. He had no way to earn a living. He had a farm. What was he going to do? Now, Jim was not against schools. Jim was on the school board of West Arlington School. There were 9 district schools in Arlington. And he actually gave property to build a school. So as the story builds, Jim was just lost without an income. Tragedy number 2. On Saturday, November 9th, 1940, the school of Arlington, the Arlington Memorial School, burned down. No one knows what caused it. No one knows really the circumstances around it. But it caught on fire, and the following morning, this is all that was left. Well, and then, of course, what happened to the kids? No one was injured in the fire, thank goodness. It was on a Saturday. The following week, they took all the different grades, and they filed kids into different homes. And they began conducting classes in homes all around Arlington. They scattered the kids around. And evidently it worked out. About a month later, January 18th, 1941, there was a special town meeting, an emergency town meeting focused on the school. And the question was, should the town appropriate $115,000 to build a new school? An enormous amount of money at the time. And there was discussion led by John Canfield. This is Dorothy Canfield Fisher's relative. Dr. Russell, a man of stature of the town. John Whalen was a moderator. You'll hear those names if you ever go to Arlington. But here we go. Jim Edgerton, the farmer, remember the farmer, stood up and he challenged the vote. You know, in a town meeting, the momentum, I call it the momentum, it's everyone kind of leans this way. They all believe this. And then someone over here pulls the crowd back. So there's a little bit of shift back and forth. Well, it was Jim Edgerton who stood up and challenged this vote to build a new school. He was worried about his livelihood. And Norman Rockwell was there, and he just observed. Well, let's move on to tragedy number 3. In Europe, what was going on? I showed you the picture of Vermont early on, but here's what's happening in Europe about the same period of time. In March of 1939, Hitler invades Czechoslovakia. Quite frankly, the Czech government had resigned early on, and it was just a walk in the park. He just walked in and took it. By the following September, Germany invades Poland. So this is what's going on in Europe. Well, what we just learned what was going on in the United States. The following spring, the surrenders of Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, France fell in 6 weeks. Some of these, like Belgium, Luxembourg, fell in 2 days. When France fell, it was the end of May, and it created the famous evacuation of Dunkirk. We had over 300,000 troops stranded on the coast of France, and that was when that famous evacuation took place. But compare and contrast what was going on in our world to what was going on in Europe. Just total devastation. Okay, now 6 months later, 6, 8, 9 months later, in 1941, President Roosevelt delivers the Four Freedoms speech.
First is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world.
Commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. That was a very powerful speech conducted 1941. Well, another 7 months go by, and here is Churchill and Roosevelt, and they conclude an Atlantic Charter, which again embraces the forces, and it's another declaration and a commitment by the Allies to pull this together. But this, keep in mind, August of 1941, the United States is not involved in the war yet, technically. But by December 7th, 41, now we're in it. And this total destruction brought us into war against both Germany and Japan. Well, at home, what was Norman Rockwell doing? You know, Norman never wanted to glorify war or anything like that. And he chose a subject. He found a guy named Bob Buck, and Bob became the center point of this humorous GI. And he was quite successful with it. And I think that it was not only in Norman's nature to do this, probably the staff, editorial staff at the Saturday Evening Post agreed with this approach. And Norman continued to paint, just fast and furious, an amazing number of Saturday Evening Post covers. And these are some of them while he lived in Arlington. Now, just as I say that, he did glorify a couple of posters. And he was asked to do these by the Ordnance Department down in Washington. And of course, the war machine was looking for everything they could to back up and get people motivated to understand what the risks were, what they were against. Norman completed a couple of poster types like this, and he actually brought this machine gun. He had the machine gun brought to his studio in West Arlington, and he had the helmet and everything. In fact, he ripped the clothing and everything to make it more impactful. But while he was down at the Ordnance Department and doing this, he met a man named Mabry. And Mabry was worked for the museum in New York, but now was working in Washington. And it was a man named Mabry who captured Norman's ear and said, look, what we really need is someone who could do something about the four freedoms. How could we paint those? How could we make those come alive? So Norman went home, but other people had tried it and attempted to paint the four freedoms. Here's an attempt here, and this was done through the auspices of the United Nations, believe it or not, at that time, that group. And here's a cornucopia of plenty. Here's maybe a Bible or some scripture and so forth. But it's a little bit mixed up. How do you get the four freedoms out of that? It's difficult. Here's another attempt over here. Now here the artist at least he's got it into four different groups, so it's more manageable. And but it's still, it's hard to really it doesn't mean much. It's a very busy painting. Well, about July, now we're talking, this is 42, and 1942, about 3 a.m. in a July time frame, Norman wakes up and he hits it with the inspiration. He wakes up and here he is, the four freedoms. He will paint the four freedoms in everyday language people understand, using my neighbors as models. Well, with that, he was so excited. He went up and woke up his friend Mead Schaefer, who lived up the road, and he told Mead all about it. Mead was excited about it. Mead had his own ideas about posters and things that he could help support the war effort. So the two of them, off to Washington. They take off to the Office of War Information with their charcoal sketches, and what did they receive? Total rejection. When they got down there, they were so excited. They'd taken the train all the way from Vermont to Washington. Total rejection. And in fact, one person down there said to Norman, you know, in the last war, we used you guys as illustrators. This war, we're going to use fine artists. And if you can imagine such a slap in the face to someone like Norman Rockwell. On the return trip from their rejection in Washington, they decided to stop over in Philadelphia and meet the new editor, Ben Hibbs, who'd taken over from Leslie Stout. This is the new editor of the Saturday Evening Post. So Ben wonders why they're in Washington. What were you guys doing down there? And Norman said, well, he told him the whole story about their visit to Washington, how they were rejected and so forth. And Ben looked at it, he said, let me see them. And Norman spread out the Four Freedoms concept, and Ben said, stop everything. Finish those four paintings. I don't want you doing any more covers, just complete those four covers. And, or the four paintings, I should say. And the same with Mead Schaefer. He gave Mead Schaefer the go-ahead. Complete your work too. And Mead had more descriptive paintings style for the war effort. But back to the studios. They both came back to Vermont. Norman working in his studio. This is one of the very few pictures you'll ever see of this studio, by the way. Mead Schaefer went back to his studio in West Arlington, approximately little over a mile apart, and both of them went to work. Now, the preliminary versions of Norman's work, some of them are here. Here is the so-called famous freedom of speech, and he was unhappy with it. He actually completed 4 versions of this painting until he got to the final one that he was satisfied with. Here's freedom of religion. Norman decided to put in a barbershop context, maybe a priest and a rabbi and a pastor and so forth. He was just having difficulty trying to get the point across. Well, he worked from the next 7 months, and he delivered his final 4 Freedoms paintings in February of 1943. Now, after he delivered them to the Saturday Evening Post, 7 months of struggle. As Norman will describe in his book, he beat his brains out trying to figure this out. He was, artists are very self-critical, and if they don't like something, and particularly in these days, they would rip the canvas up, burn the canvas up, and it's today we cringe at thinking about those burning barrels that these men used. But it was February of 1943 that he made the delivery. And it was so successful, they were published in the Saturday Evening Post from February through March. They weren't on the cover. They were on the inside editions every other week. And they were spaced out, all 4 paintings. Well, they were so well received, and there was so much clamor for copies of those images that actually the folks in Washington, the OWI, Office of War Information, they ordered 4.5 million copies by themselves. And a bond tour to raise funds for the war effort began. Norman met celebrities like Mrs. DuPont and Thurman Arnold. He's the Assistant Attorney General. And Norman has this hilarious exchange, again, with Mrs. DuPont. Norman is sitting on the podium along with Mrs. DuPont and Mr. Arnold, and she would turn to Norman Rockwell, and she thought he was Rockwell Kent. Poor Norman was exhausted. He just couldn't take this kind of thing. And it was Ben Hibbs, thank goodness for Ben Hibbs, that directed Norman go back to Vermont. And we'll go on with the bond tour. We'll continue this. And here we begin the bond tour. It started in Washington, D.C., and then it would move up to these various cities raising money. It was just a giant fundraising machine for the war effort. And as they continued along, Norman left the group here, and then they went to Philadelphia, and then they went up to New York, Boston, and so forth. They jumped around a little bit. But over the next year and a half, they circulated through the United States, and they were raising money, and they were giving away the 4 Freedoms images, the bond tour images, not giving them away, but for your bond donation. The bottom line to this is that they raised over $132 million in bond money, which today is over $1 billion. It was the most successful bond tour effort during the war effort.
The tall man with a high hat and a whiskers on his chin will soon be knocking at your door, and you ought to be in. The tall man with the high hat will be coming down your way. Get your savings out when you hear him shout, any bonds today? Come on and get 'em, folks. Come on, skip right up and get 'em. Any bonds today? Bonds of freedom, that's what I'm selling. Any bonds today? Scrape up the most you can. Here comes the freedom man, asking you to buy your share of freedom today.
Here comes the freedom man.
Can't make tomorrow's plan,
Not unless you buy a share of freedom today. Any stamps, any bonds today.
I believe that it wasn't only financially successful, it was emotionally successful. These 4 paintings made people come together. We went back to Benjamin Franklin's day. It's a part of our ingrained, it's part of our society. It's what we're about, these freedoms. It was necessary. It gave us an understanding of what are we fighting for, really, and it was Winston Churchill and Roosevelt who kind of coalesced this idea down and simplified it, but it was Norman Rockwell who put it in a picture that we could all understand. Now, some of the Arlington artists, Arlington models who participated, and these happen to be some pictures, some photographs. I picked this is Shirley Hoisington and her McTurnan, and before she died a few years ago, she let me copy these photographs that she had. This is when they were in Boston. Here's the Boston baked beans, you can see. But here's Carl Hess. Carl Hess, a handsome man who stood up, and he was the model for freedom of speech. And these other folks were in modeling for freedom from want. But it shows that there are real faces and real people behind the models and behind these pictures. Now, Ben Hibbs, thank goodness for Ben Hibbs. I guess if you're named Ben, you're a pretty good guy. Ben Franklin, Ben Hibbs. But, and I think this is astonishing. Ben Hibbs asked Norman to write something. Norman said, I can't write anything about my own paintings. So Ben Hibbs did. The result astonished us all. To me, the paintings are great human documents in the form of a paint and canvas. A great picture, I think, is one which moves and inspires millions of people. The 4 freedoms did and still do. And I think they still do today. Well, a month later, Norman Rockwell's studio burns to the ground. If you can imagine, these 4 freedoms paintings narrowly escaped being done. And I believe if they had not been produced, I wonder how much longer that war effort would have been. But typical Norman, he took it in stride, and he did this picture and this painting for the Saturday Evening Post and made humor of it, actually. In fact, it was so humorous, and imagine he lost everything. He lost his paints, he lost his all his paintings, his collection of costumes, he lost his antiques, he lost his pipe collection, he lost it all. And you know, he just said, I'm going to move on. In fact, he made it sound so good that his friend Meade Schaefer said, I felt like going home and burning down my own studio. Well, by 1945, the war ends. It was a horrible war. 100 million people died in that period of time, all over the world. In Arlington, a new school was built, and it's still there today. And Norman moved next door to his old friend, Jimmy Edgerton. And here's Jimmy Edgerton's house, and here's Norman's. So they were best of friends and inspired by each other, really. I was interested in this story, this period of time, inspired by this book called The 4 Freedoms, written by author Stuart Murray. And it's out of publication, but you can still find it on Amazon. And this one is in publication. You can find this as well. But anyway, these 2 books kind of inspired me about this period of time and this history. But just take a look at these wonderful paintings, and I think if you recall the picture that I showed, one of the preliminary paintings of freedom of speech, you see how busy it was before, and now you focus on that, And what I love about this is it tells that story in any language. And by the way, these Bond tour images were sent overseas, all over, published millions and millions more copies. So people all over the world understand this, and they crave these freedoms as well as we do here in our country. Freedom of worship, again, I think he, of course, Norman hated criticism, but he hated, that's why he was so detailed. But I think he captured this in a way that was easy for everyone to understand. But he was criticized by one man who said, well, you have everybody facing in the same direction. So you come out with this crazy stuff, but I think he says it well. Norman was most proud of these two paintings, freedom of worship and freedom of speech. Freedom from want, you know, a lot of criticism about Norman is that he doesn't, he's not a fine artist. Well, you look at that silverware and this stuff and tell me you can't drink out of these glasses and eat off these dishes. He's as fine an artist as you'll ever see. But he felt that he could have done a little bit better with that subject, but nevertheless, I think it did capture, and a lot of people today will say this is my favorite. And finally, freedom from fear. And there it is in a quiet setting, really I think says a lot. And by the way, this model here, Marjorie Squires, is still alive. She lives in Arlington. And her brother, David, is, however, he has Alzheimer's. And Marjorie, I saw Marjorie in the grocery store a couple months ago, and she said that someone showed David an image of this thing, and David knew, he connected. So wherever he is, he still is connected to this. Well, thank you very much.
This nation has placed its destiny in the hands and heads and hearts of its millions of free men and women, and its faith in freedom under the guidance of God. Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain those rights and keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose to that high concept that can be no end save victory.
The tall man with a high hat and a whiskers on his chin will soon be knocking at your door, and you ought to be in. The tall man with the high hat will be coming down your way. Get your savings out when you hear him shout, any bonds today? Come on and get 'em, folks. Come on, skip right up and get 'em. Any bonds today? Bonds of freedom, that's what I'm selling. Any bonds today? Scrape up the most you can. Here comes the freedom man, asking you to buy your share of freedom today.
The freedom man.
Can't make tomorrow's plan,
Not unless you buy a share of freedom today. Any stamps, any bonds today.